My name is Leta Weiner Levinger. Um, from most of my life, my family calls me Lee, which I like better because no one can pronounce Leta correctly. And I was born in 1933, and the first 2 years of my life I lived in the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which is the first hotel that my dad bought. And then we moved to Pine Street in Morton Meadows. And I went to Beals School for from kindergarten through 8th grade and graduated in 1950. No, 46. And then I went to Central High School, and I ran around in grade school with Natalie Shapiro and Hannah Sherman. Those were my close friends. But in high school, I became friends with Janice Ringel and Diane Cooper and Charney Taub. Those are my close friends. And Janice has passed away, and Diane is in a nursing home in Columbus, Ohio. And Charney is still in Omaha, and we are still good friends. Then I went to college. I was 17, and I went to the University of Wisconsin. And my mom and dad said, "Why don't you go to Nebraska, where all your friends are?" Nope. I wanted to go to Wisconsin, and Adrian Rice went there, and I think that's all I know from Omaha that went there the year I did. We lived in the same house. It was called Shoreland House, and I could not appreciate Wisconsin. I was too young for it. It was very sophisticated. They served beer in the student union, and I hadn't dated hardly at all, and so Wisconsin was not for me. And I came back to Nebraska, and all of a sudden I matured. I had a wonderful time at Nebraska. I went there 3 years, joined SDT, made lots of friends, dated a lot, and graduated in 1954. And while I was there in my junior year, one of the fraternity brothers called and asked if I would go out with one of their fraternity brothers who was in the service at this time. His name was Chuck Levinger. And I happened to room with a girl named Adele Chesnov, who went with Chuck's brother, Bud. And so I didn't know Chuck, but I knew Bud, and I wasn't thrilled with Bud, the way he treated my roommate, and so I told this ZBT fraternity brother, no, I would not go out with Chuck. But he begged me, please, please. So I said, okay, so I did. And Chuck flew in town in a jet. He was stationed at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix. And his cousin lived in Lincoln. And he said, why don't you come to a Chamber of Commerce dinner with us? Bring your date. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't want to go to a Chamber of Commerce dinner with all these old people. But that's what we did. And a sideline is we had pork for dinner. I'd never had pork. And that was on a Saturday night. And Sunday Chuck came over to the sorority house, and he took me to the airport to see his jet. And I had on a new pedal pusher outfit. and we're climbing up the steps to the tower, and the back of my pedal pushers ripped. And I turned around. I didn't want Chuck to see that. And I turned around and walked up the stairs backwards. But we got through that, and he came in a couple more times, and we hardly dated. Then he went to Korea, and he was on leave in December of my senior year, and we wrote letters back and forth from Korea. He was telling me all about his missions and such, and he called me in December, and he asked if I was going to be in Omaha and if he could come in and we could go out during Christmas vacation. And I got up the nerve and said, "Are you asking me out for New Year's?" Because that was a big deal in those days. And he said, "I think that would be a good idea." And so it was New Year's Eve. He came in, and he came to the door with a corsage, his fraternity pin, and a poem. And I was shocked. We hadn't talked about this at all. And I went upstairs. I said to my mother, "What should I do? What should I do?" And she said, "Don't you want to teach before you become pinned and engaged and the rest?" And I said, "Nope, I do not." And so we got pinned New Year's Eve, and I think the whole time we were dating, we saw each other maybe 8 times at the most. And we got married in August of 1954. And that's the story of our meeting together. And I never did teach. We moved to Yankton, South Dakota, and we lived in Phoenix first till 1955. And then he got out of the service, and then we moved to Yankton, South Dakota. And I lived there 65 years. When we were in Yankton, Chuck went to work in the women's ready-to-wear store that his grandfather started, and his father was in the business. And it was called Fantles, which is his mother's maiden name. And because his grandfather on his mother's side started the store, so it was called Fantles. And his grandfather's brothers started another Fantles store in Sioux Falls, but it was not the same corporation. It's different. So Chuck worked in the store, and before we had children, I did volunteer work. I worked in the gift shop at the hospital. I had a little girl's brownie troop, and I worked at the state hospital helping young people with their homeworks. It was the state mental hospital, and I didn't work there very long because I couldn't handle it. So then, after we were married about 3 years, we had Jeff. And then 3 years later, we had Steve, and 3 years later, we had Jay. And I stayed home and did more volunteer work while the boys were growing up. And then after the boys were in high school, I started working at our store, which I loved to sell, and that's what I did for quite a few years. And then Chuck eventually retired, and the store was sold, and I worked there for probably another year, and then I retired too and started playing a lot of bridge and mahjong. The boys were all married, and grandkids were starting to come when I was about either 54 or 56. Steve was the first one to get married. Steve is the middle one. And he married Bonnie from Phoenix. And they had a beautiful wedding in Phoenix. And then they moved to Michigan, where Steve had a job. He went to the University of Michigan and got his first job there. And after their first daughter was born, they moved to Omaha. And she was just a few months old. And then that same, Steve was married in December, and the next September, Jeff was married to Terry. She was from Louisiana. My youngest sister, Betty, fixed them up. She knew Terry from the beauty shop, and he married Terry, and I forgot to say, Steve had 3 daughters, so that's where I got my girls. And Jeff and Terry had 2 boys, and then Jay got married a few years later, and he married Michelle, and they have 1 son, Andrew, who is now 16. So he is my youngest grandchild. Steve has 2 daughters that are married. Allison married Adam, and they live in Pittsburgh. And Amy married Paul, and they live in New York City. And of course, Andrew is not married. He is a wonderful soccer player. I forgot to mention that my dad's parents came from Russia. And he came from Russia when he was 3 years old. And my mom's parents came from Russia, and they settled in Mason City, Iowa. And my mom was born in Mason City. And we went to Mason City, except for my dad, who had to work, every summer until I was 16. And I loved Mason City. It was a small town, and I think that's why I loved Yankton, because it was a small town. My grandfather in Mason City was one of the founders of the synagogue there. And I don't know the population, but it was a small enough town that they could walk to the synagogue. And of course, my other grandparents settled in Omaha, and they went to the Orthodox. But we went to the Reform Temple, Israel. But my dad on the holidays would always split it. He would go to the Orthodox and the temple. And my mom sometimes would go with him. And sometimes we would too, as young children. And we sat upstairs and the men sat downstairs. And we didn't understand a thing that was going on. And that's the way it was in those days. As we got older, Chuck developed Parkinson's, but you would not know he had it for probably 20 years until maybe 5 years ago, which is 2015 maybe. He developed some dementia with his Parkinson's, and it continued to get worse, and I had 24/7 help come in because I couldn't do it alone. Then Steve and Bonnie sat me down one day and they said, "You have to move to Omaha because you can't, your help, some come from 20 miles away and winter's coming and you might be left without any help. And I had fallen a couple of times, and so sometimes I was on a walker, sometimes I wasn't, sometimes I used a cane, and I just couldn't do it myself if he fell. And so with much thought and sadness, I decided I had to move to Omaha, and it had to be quick. So the boys came one weekend. We had to tear up the house, and we had a dumpster outside that was filled to the top. We had things to take to Omaha. We had things to put in an auction, and they were wonderful in deciding that. I helped them with some, but I couldn't do it all. There was too much after living there for 64 or 65 years. Plus the fact that Chuck won an honor for being in the service. It was a national group of quilters, and they were presenting him with this handmade quilt. And it had to be on the day before we left, and the house was a mess. I had to have a little reception, and they were presenting him with this quilt, and everything was in chaos. And the boys got it done on that Saturday. We had to leave by 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, and I don't know how we did it, but we did, and we got to the Blumpkin home by, I think, 1 o'clock. And they moved me into One Pacific Place. Steve found an apartment there, and Chuck was in the Blumpkin home. I was in One Pacific Place, and that's where it stands right now. I have adjusted. Thank goodness. I've made friends. I don't know that Chuck has adjusted totally to the Blumpkin home, but it's the best place he can be. And that seems to be our story up to this point. I just forgot to mention that we lived in Yankton, South Dakota when the boys were growing up. And so we didn't have a synagogue there. It was only, at that time, 10,000 people. So every Sunday we went to Sunday school in Sioux City for 16 years. And it wasn't easy. It was Chuck's only day off from the retail business. And whenever there was a snow day, we all cheered because we didn't go. But anyway, Jeff decided he would like a bar mitzvah, and Chuck's brother lived in Sioux City with 3 children, and one of his daughters was the same age as Jeff, so we decided to do it together. And Jeff and I learned Hebrew together as well as we could, and Jeff had a bar mitzvah with Janet Levinger. And then a few years later, Steve decided he too wanted a bar mitzvah. And there was another cousin named, I did that wrong. Jeff had it with Michael Levinger, his cousin. And Steve had it with Janet Levinger. And that went very well. We learned Hebrew again together. And then after 16 years, Jay said, I don't want to go to Sioux City anymore to Sunday school, and I don't want a bar mitzvah. So we talked to the rabbi and told him that, which he truly did not understand, but that was okay. We had had it. So that was the end of the Sunday school and the bar mitzvahs. But I also want to tell my grandchildren now how much I hope they know that I love them beyond anything, and just hope that they have as wonderful a life as I did.